Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I am coming at you with a wrap-up of all the books that I read in June. And the first two books I want to talk about briefly are Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata and Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. And I recently made a video reviewing these two books because they both follow single 30-something women who are considered socially abnormal and lead rather isolated, lonely lives. But that's kind of where the similarities end. Convenience Store Woman is a slim, simply worded book that manages to satirize modern society while also dipping beneath the gleaming surface of capitalism and conformity, to question the hypocrisy of social norms and expectations, and to explore how all of us create a sense of meaning within the machine of society. It's a kind of strange little book that has surprising depth and a dark, deadpan sense of humor throughout that I really enjoyed. Eleanor Oliphant, on the other hand, is an exploration of one woman's loneliness and how it stems in part from past traumas, and we follow her as she finally begins to confront those traumas and open herself up to other people. And despite some downright sinister elements of Eleanor's backstory, this is ultimately a neat, tidy, feel-good book, but I personally just didn't jibe with it at all. I thought Eleanor was an unbelievable and inconsistent character, and I thought that there were aspects of her backstory that were over the top and exaggerated in order to kind of amp up the entertainment value and mystery elements of the book, and in some ways to emotionally manipulate the reader, which all felt a little bit cheap to me. So yeah, it just wasn't for me, but if you want to hear my full thoughts on both of these books, I'm going to link my review video down below, so feel free to check that out. Next up, I have South and West by Joan Didion, and as some of you may know, I am a huge Joan Didion fan. I did a whole video about her nonfiction books back in November. This is her most recently published work, and it is a collection of notes and sketches from a trip that Joan Didion took to the Deep South in the summer of 1970. The piece that she intended to write about that trip never materialized, and so this resulting volume does have the feel of a notebook. It's very fragmentary and aimless, and while it lacks a kind of clear narrative thrust, the strength of Joan Didion's observations and the way she is able to distill those impressions down to sleek and perfect prose make this well worth the read. This book also epitomizes a quality you'll find in a lot of Joan Didion's writing, which is that she is both the ultimate insider while also kind of remaining stubbornly on the outside looking in. When she's in the Deep South, she often finds herself having dinners and drinks with prominent members of the communities she's traveling through, but she is also the sort of consummate observer who is always a few steps removed from the people and the places that she's writing about. And the result in this book is that it is dripping in coastal elitism. And what you get is a picture of this modern California woman who feels deeply out of place and disoriented in the stifling Gulf Coast heat and in a culture that expects women to have teased updos and to be married by the age of 19. And Didion definitely leans into Southern mythology and stereotypes throughout this collection, and the Deep South, through her eyes, is a region in a state of decay, haunted by a past that it won't confront and burdened by an oppressive, ominous climate that constantly threatens storms and flooding and hurricanes. And running under all of it is Didion's thinly veiled disdain for the white men who have profited off a culture built on slave labor, a racialized feudal system, and the subjugation of women. In New Orleans, the wilderness is sensed as very near, not the redemptive wilderness of the Western imagination, but something rank and old and malevolent, the idea of wilderness not as an escape from civilization and its discontents, but as a mortal threat to a community society, precarious and colonial in its deepest aspect. So she has some fascinating insights throughout this book and really doesn't hold back. But if you haven't read Joan Didion before, I don't know that I would recommend starting here just because it is so fragmented and she is quite condescending at times. But if you're a Joan Didion fan, then I definitely recommend checking this out simply for the pleasure of reading her prose. Next up, I have Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo by Zora Neale Hurston. And this is the long neglected but recently published account of Cudjo Lewis, who was one of the few remaining survivors of the last known slave ship to transport people forcibly from Africa to America in 1859. And what's remarkable about this book is not only the fact that it is the narrative of a person who experienced slavery in America, of which there are far too few considering the millions of people who endured that so-called peculiar institution, but it's also the perspective of someone who experienced life in Africa, slavery in America, and then Reconstruction in the Deep South. And it's really the life before slavery in Africa and after slavery in Alabama that takes center stage in Cudjo's narrative, which Zora Neale Hurston relays in the vernacular in an attempt to capture the essence of Cudjo's voice. And she lets his voice command the narrative, and you really feel like you're listening to this older person tell you about the trials and tribulations of their life. And what really made a deep impression on me was Cudjo's unending ache for Africa and the deep and ever-present pain of having been violently severed from his homeland. And one of the most crushing moments in the book is when, after having been enslaved for 6 years, the Civil War ends and Cudjo is told that he's now free, and the first thought that comes to mind is that now he can go back to Africa. And why wouldn't he think that? That's a completely logical and fair conclusion. But the utter impossibility of that hope just really underscores how cruel and how absurd the institution of slavery was. And Cudjo is a person who in one lifetime experiences tremendous hardship and tragedy, and running under it all is that sense of displacement and loneliness and homesickness that persists throughout Cudjo's life. And although he's in his late 80s when he meets Hurston, he tells her his African name, Kasala, in the hope that eventually her account of his life will make it back to his people and his family and his friends, and they'll know what happened to him. So I really can't recommend this book enough as both a remarkable historical document and as an incredibly moving human story. Next up, I have Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeleine Tien, which I was so looking forward to because I had heard great things about it from a number of different people on BookTube, and sadly, this was just not the book for me. If you're not already familiar, this is a rather sprawling, multi-generational story about two families living through the Cultural Revolution in China in the 60s and 70s, and then the student protests and political uprisings in Tiananmen Square in 1989. And while the historical backdrop of this book is rich in narrative possibilities, I ultimately found this book to be thematically heavy-handed, poorly paced, and filled with a cast of thinly drawn characters. And let's start with that, because I think that the most critical way that this book fails is in its characters. And I've heard a few people say that it can be difficult to keep track of the characters in this book because there are so many of them, and their names are kind of difficult, and the narrative jumps around in time. But I think the reason that it's hard to keep track of them is because none of them are well developed or distinct individuals. 3 of the main characters in this book are musicians at the Shanghai Conservatory, which becomes a target of the Cultural Revolution. And the way that each of them talks and thinks and feels about music is exactly the same, to the point that you almost can only distinguish them by what instrument they play. Too many of the characters in this book seem to bleed together, and too many of them seem to be different iterations of the same character. And I think that that might be intentional on Tien's part, because she is very interested in the cyclical nature of storytelling and the ways that stories are copied and repeated and retold and altered over the course of history. But I do think it ultimately sacrifices the integrity and individuality of the characters in this book. And on top of that, it too often feels like the characters in this book are simply there to witness and endure the injustices of China's tumultuous political history, to the extent that this book is suffused with an almost debilitating sense of fatalism. And I do think that Madeline Tian was trying to make a point about how people can get swept up in history and in crowds and in movements, but these characters felt too buffeted about by history and the wind, and their complete inability to exact any sort of agency over their own lives felt very frustrating to me. It all felt just like too predetermined. And I think that's partly because Tian is so intent on hammering home specific themes and points throughout this book. And while for the first 100 pages or so, I found her questions about storytelling and personal history and identity really interesting, as the book goes on, those ideas and themes are touched on again and again and again, and characters give these poetic monologues that all sound the same, and the extent to which Tian leans on rhetorical questions as a device is like almost criminal, and it just all becomes exhaustingly repetitive. And so while I admire Tian's ambitions, I do think that the humanity of her characters and any sort of emotional resonance was lost in the broader historical and thematic sweep of this story. And lastly, I have Janesville, An American Story by Amy Goldstein. And this is about a small industrial community in southeast Wisconsin that was once home to a large General Motors assembly plant. And that plant closed in 2008 amid the Great Recession, and this book traces the economic fallout of that plant closure and its impact on the community. This was one of President Obama's favorite books of 2017, and I picked it up because I grew up in a small town about 20 minutes north of Janesville, and Goldstein's narrative approach in this book reminds me of Matthew Desmond's in the book Evicted, in that she's looking at the community of Janesville as a whole, but she's also zeroing in on a handful of specific individuals and families in order to illustrate how the middle class in America is really falling out from under us. And although much ink has been spilt detailing the woes and economic anxieties of the white working class, I did think this was a nuanced and even-handed portrait of a community struggling with jobs and pensions that are disappearing, with wages that are plummeting, and with job retraining and education that doesn't seem to be leading to any new opportunities. And most significantly, it's not a reductive attempt to garner sympathy for white people or to explain why Trump was elected. And the politics in this book are actually really interesting because Janesville has historically been a Union Democrat town, and it voted for Hillary in the 2016 election. And I obviously have a particular local interest in this book, and I'm from such a small town that it was actually very jarring to read about places like the Friskies pet food plant that I used to drive by growing up, or about the charity closet at the high school in Janesville that my friend's mom used to teach at. But I do think it's an interesting microcosm of what's happening economically across America, and it was ultimately a kind of depressing look at how the middle-class American dream is becoming more and more untenable. Those were all the books that I read in June. If you've read any of these and have thoughts, definitely let me know, or let me know some of the best books that you read this month. Thanks as always for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye!